Schmidt, I want to start with you. What is missing in those call logs?
Well, so the call logs are supposed to show basically who was calling into the White House switchboard, into the Oval Office, and the calls that were going out from there. This is a long-standing system that the White House has had that tracks the president's correspondences. Such a log, a group of numbers in a log like that, would be critically important to the investigation, because what they're trying to figure out is what is truly going on behind closed doors on January 6th in the West Wing. That is one of the biggest lines of this inquiry. So if you are doing that investigation and you are most focused on that, or as focused on that as any other part of this, those call logs would be really important, because we know about different calls that went on between Trump and members of Congress who were in the Capitol at the time that this was going on. So what happens is that the committee gets the phone records from the National Archives, and despite the fact that the committee knows that there were calls that Trump had, they do not show up in those call logs. So why don't they show up in the call logs? There's no evidence that the call logs were tampered with or deleted. What we believe may have happened is that Trump was using other people's cell phones, or perhaps his own cell phone, to communicate. And what that means is that recreating this crucial period of time in which we are trying to, the committee and the media and everyone else is trying to figure out what was Trump doing, why was there such a delay in the National Guard being deployed. Piecing that period of time together will be all the more difficult now, because they will have to sort of work backwards and around Trump by subpoenaing phone records of different people who were around him to try and figure out what those conversations were.
Michael, there is a detail you shared there that I just want to read a little bit more about from your reporting. Quote, since the January 6, 2021 attack, former Trump administration officials have said that investigators would struggle to piece together a complete record of Trump's conversations that day because, as you said, of his habit of using his and other people's cell phones. At least one person who tried to reach Mr. Trump on his cell phone on January 6th had their call picked up by one of his aides. It is unclear where Mr. Trump was at the time. Can you talk to us just a little bit more about this habit? Seems highly unusual of just using other people's cell phones.
Look, Donald Trump did a lot of things that were highly unusual, and a lot of things, as we've seen in the past few days, that run in the face of typical record keeping and typical functioning of government. I'm not exactly sure what the Presidential Records Act says about whether the president has to use the landline from the Oval Office to do this. But what Trump would do is that he would use his phone and other people's phones to make calls on open lines where he often talked about things that his aides were concerned that he was talking about, because it would be so easy for a foreign adversary to listen in on such a conversation. So the president functioning differently than previous presidents by using his cell phone so much while he was in office. And the question now is that, was that a government cell phone that he was using? Was it a private cell phone? We know at one point he did have a personal cell phone when he was in the White House. How can the Select Committee figure out how that phone was being used, and who are the individuals around the president whose phone he was using to talk to different people? You can imagine a scenario where a lot of different folks were calling the White House trying to talk to the president. Perhaps they were calling aides that were close to Trump, and the calls came in that way. But at the most fundamental level, the most important thing about this is that piecing this period together, this highly critical period together, is now going to be more difficult for the committee.
Right. Betsy, to that point, how big of a challenge is this issue of the missing call logs for the committee?
It's certainly one that they're going to have to grapple with, but it's also something that brings an interesting opportunity, because whoever else's cell phone then President Trump might have used to have these conversations during the January 6th attack, that person is likely an invaluable witness to the committee. They can figure out whose phones he was using, which people were handing phones to the president to set up these calls. Those people become targets number 1, 2, 3, 4 for new subpoenas if they aren't under subpoena already. Raises questions about whose phones might have been in the mix that day. We know Ivanka Trump, of course, spent a ton of time with her dad as the attack was unfolding. We know Mark Meadows, who's been referred to DOJ for refusing to comply with a subpoena thus far, had a lot of visibility into what was going on with the president in terms of his specific response to the attack. And the fact now that we know that some phones other than the ones that the Select Committee has gotten records about were used for these communications raises what could potentially be a promising new line of inquiry. Of course, that said, the Select Committee has a whole bunch of lines of inquiries that are already underway, and they're working under a tight deadline because of their concerns that Republicans will flip the House in November during the midterm elections. So while on the one hand, there's a little bit of promise here, at the same time, any new challenge, any new time-consuming undertaking is, of course, a hurdle as well for investigators there.
Exactly, as time is of the essence. Neil, is that how you see it, a potential new line of inquiry? And if not, the way that Betsy has laid out, is there another way for investigators to get around this issue of the missing records?
Totally new line of inquiry, and it's really unfortunate because this gap may make the 18 minutes of the Nixon tapes case that we're missing look quaint by contrast. And you had said it's unusual to borrow cell phones from other people, but it's not unusual if you're a mobster, and because you do it because it makes things tough to trace. And that's what it looks like is going on here. I'm sure that Trump would have made his calls on payphones if that didn't imply he had to leave the house. Indeed, Trump really did operate in this, this is of a piece with other stories in which he ran the presidency like a mob boss. If you don't create a record, you can't get caught. And what he didn't realize is that the presidency is more like filing your taxes. You're liable for the stuff you forget to include. And, well, I guess, to be fair, it's not like he could draw on much personal experience paying taxes either. But the fundamental point here is that, there's an entire legal regime to ensure the preservation of records. The Presidential Records Act is part of that. And when you go into the government, on like day one, you're told you can't use other cell phones. You got to use only your phone for official work, only your official email. There's a whole suite of things you're told. And, it's impossible that Trump wasn't told those things. He had to have been told. So that makes a criminal investigation of this by the Justice Department more likely. This is an easier thing than some of the other stuff, and it is of a piece with all these missing document stories.